Hey, and welcome to the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Friday, February 10, 2017, where I review 5 podcasts in around 5 minutes. And no need to take notes, just have a listen. If a podcast grabs your interest, you'll find a link to it right on your screen. It couldn't be easier. Well, the first podcast I should perhaps have covered a couple of months ago before the holiday season. It's called Awesome Etiquette, and it might have come in handy for some of those enforced family gatherings. But the reality is, Awesome Etiquette is a good idea all year round. The podcast is hosted by cousins Lizzie Post and Daniel Post, and they are the great-great-grandchildren of Emily Post, who wrote the definitive book on etiquette back in 1922. But rather than just dealing with issues like how to place cutlery properly on the table, Lizzie and Daniel Post deal with modern etiquette issues that would probably have their great-great-grandmother spinning in her grave. Issues like, do you swipe left or right when you see a workmate on Tinder, unfriending on Facebook, or managing a lesbian wedding guest list? Of course, they also deal with many of the more traditional etiquette questions as well. Each episode is driven by listener questions, usually 3 to 4 questions per episode, and the advice is actually really good, and it's delivered in a way that's entertaining and doesn't take itself too seriously. Sometimes there's not a definitive correct answer, but the discussion between the two hosts provides a great way to think about similar issues we all run up against. There's over 120 episodes up at the moment, so it's worth scrolling the episode list where you'll almost certainly see etiquette issues relevant to your life. So that's Awesome Etiquette. Next podcast is called Like I'm a 6-Year-Old. So the host of Like I'm a 6-Year-Old is Australian comedian Tom Ballard, and essentially the setup is that Tom is often inspired by a film or a song or a person to take a more active role in addressing various social issues, but he doesn't know where to start, and maybe he doesn't really understand the complexities involved in many of the issues. So each episode he has a relevant guest on to explain it to him like a 6-year-old. He's got around 90 episodes up at the moment, and the guests range from writers, politicians and activists through to entertainers and comedians, both left and right wing, and even one episode with his parents as guests. Most, but not all guests are Australian, but the issues are usually universal. Tom's a 27-year-old, so he brings a good younger perspective versus many podcast interviewers who are in their 40s or 50s. I think it's a good one and worth checking out, and the link, of course, is on your screen. On to podcast number 3, something a bit different and a bit specialist. It's called The Mastering Show. Now, you're either going to be into this or not. Mastering or audio mastering is the broad term applied to the process of preparing or finishing recorded audio for broadcast or release. It could be for a music track, a whole album, an interview for radio, the soundtrack of a movie or a TV commercial, or even a podcast. And mastering is all about polishing the mix to make it sound as perfect as it can be. The host, Ian Shepherd, is a mastering engineer, and he describes mastering as Photoshop for audio. And that's not a bad analogy, especially because now professional mastering software can run on your laptop, and so anyone who sings or plays in a band or produces a podcast can master in their home studio, which might actually mean the kitchen table or the bedroom. Mastering is a bit of an art, and a lot of people are out there now attempting to master, but not really sure what they're aiming for. That's where the Mastering Show podcast comes in. It's easy to listen to, it's entertaining, and it's like an ongoing professional training program with episodes on compression, limiting, EQ, loudness, dynamic range, analog versus digital, and a whole lot more. In fact, even if you don't master but have an interest in audio production, you'll probably find at least some of the episodes interesting, like understanding what exactly is dynamic range. Also, if you do happen to be a podcast producer, then there's an episode dedicated to podcast mastering, and every podcast producer should listen to it because as podcast listeners, we all know that podcast audio can often be all over the place. Anyhow, that's The Mastering Show. Fourth podcast this episode is The Moth. This is one of the better-known podcasts out there, so you may have heard of it. In fact, The Moth started as a radio program back in 1997, and the idea is that ordinary people stand up in front of a live audience and, without notes, tell a story about a significant event from their lives. In some ways, The Moth is a bit like TED Talks for everyday people. Although the stories are without notes, it's obvious that a fair bit of cultivation and refinement of the stories takes place before they're told, which is a good thing. Using some of the classic storytelling techniques helps to really draw you into the stories and creates a certain tension that keeps you listening. If you enjoy classic storytelling, and I think most of us do, even if we don't realise it, then The Moth is a great podcast to check out. Each episode typically runs just under an hour and features 2 to 3 storytellers. Last podcast this episode is called You Are Not So Smart. It's a provocative title, maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, and the podcast description on iTunes describes You Are Not So Smart as a celebration of self-delusion that explores topics related to cognitive biases and logical fallacies. The host, David McRaney, is a journalist who became fascinated with the many ways in which our brains can unwittingly fool us. Originally, he started a blog on the subject, and this evolved into the You Are Not So Smart podcast. I've always found this type of thing fascinating, but in the current climate of fake news and so-called alternative facts, it takes on a whole new relevance. We all know people, smart people, who believe things that we know are not true, but no amount of evidence or logic seems to change their minds. But the reality is, we are almost certainly guilty of exactly the same thing, at least on certain pet subjects. If you want a good episode to start with, try episode 72 on the Dunning-Kruger effect, something we're all affected by. And in this episode, Professor Dunning himself explains the Dunning-Kruger effect. There's a link to this specific episode, along with the main You Are Not So Smart podcast link on your screen. Well, that's it. 5 podcasts in around 5 minutes. I'll see you next week with 5 more. Thanks for listening.